Most of Britain's Roman cities were never Roman ideas. 10 of them, ranked here, already had kings, minted coins, and dug streets before a single legion landed in AD 43. One chief's stronghold was named for a war god a century before Rome cared about Britain at all. One market town controlled a river crossing so old the tribe that used it had no fixed capital to conquer. And one stretch of Wiltshire ground has had someone living on it since roughly 8820 BC, nearly 9,000 years before any of this. 10 places, ranked from genuinely old to almost impossible to believe. We start with the honest, less dramatic end of the list, because this whole countdown only works if the early entries earn the later ones. Gloucester doesn't have a documented native town underneath it. The Dumnonii farmed and herded across the Cotswolds and the Severn Valley in the centuries before Rome. They lived in small, scattered villages rather than one walled capital. So there's no lost Dumnonii city buried under the modern high street. What made this exact spot on the map matter wasn't a town at all. It was a crossing. Gloucester sits at the lowest point where the River Severn could be bridged, and people had been using that crossing for generations before anyone in Rome had heard of Britain. When the Romans founded the colony, they called Glevum, sometime around AD 96 to 98, under the Emperor Nerva, they weren't conquering an old city. They were arriving late to an old road. That distinction matters for the rest of this list, and we will come back to it. Sometimes what looks ancient about a place isn't the buildings on top of the ground, but the ground itself and the paths people wore into it, long before anyone thought to build something permanent. The road that carries traffic across the Severn today still follows roughly the same line the Romans chose, and the Romans chose it because Britons had already proven for generations that it was the place to cross. Gloucester earns its spot here for the crossing, not the city, and that's exactly the kind of honest correction this list is going to keep making. It would be easy to round up and call this a native town that Rome simply took over. The way it happens later in this list, it would also be wrong. The fairest way to put it is that Rome built a brand new colony on a much older route, and both halves of that sentence matter. Entry 9 gives us something Gloucester couldn't offer. An actual settlement you can point to. On the east bank of the River Soar, right next to a ford, late Iron Age Britons built a cluster of round timber houses that likely covered around 8 hectares. That isn't a myth passed down through folklore. It's a documented pattern of huts, hearths and boundary ditches that archaeologists have traced along that riverbank. The name tells you what kind of place it was before Rome ever touched it. Ratae is an old British word for ramparts, which means the settlement's own name announced that it was defended. The people living there were the Corieltauvi, a tribe who controlled that river crossing on their own terms for generations. Rome's contribution here amounted to a road, not a town. One of the great engineered roads of Roman Britain, the Fosse Way, was routed straight through the same ford the Corieltauvi had already been using. Picture that for a second. Roman surveyors planning a road meant to connect Lincoln in the northeast to Exeter in the southwest. Looked at the terrain and picked the crossing point that local Britons had already worn smooth, with generations of foot traffic. The ramparts came first, the road came second. That order matters more than it sounds like it should. A road tells you where an empire wants to go. A ford with ramparts around it tells you where people were already living, trading and defending themselves long before any empire had an opinion on the matter. Leicester's Iron Age residents didn't know they were picking a spot that would end up on a Roman engineer's map centuries later. They just knew where the river was shallow enough to cross safely, which turned out to be exactly the kind of practical decision that outlasts most political ones. Entry 8 is stranger than either of the first two, because here Rome wasn't chasing a town or a crossing. It was chasing a tribe that never had a single home base to begin with. The Dumnonii controlled most of the southwest peninsula, and unlike the tribes further east, they never built one central oppidum. Their power spread across a network of separate hillforts, places like Cadbury Castle, and small farming villages scattered through what's now Devon and Cornwall. That makes the promontory where Exeter now sits an interesting case. The high ground above the River Exe would have made an obvious defensive position, easy to reach for water and fish and easy to hold against attack, and it's reasonable to think Britons used it before Rome arrived. But 2,000 years of building on top of that hill have erased almost any direct evidence of what stood there first. So when the Second Augustan Legion built the fortress they called Isca Dumnoniorum around AD 55, they weren't toppling a native capital, because the Dumnonii never gave them one to topple. They were planting a fortress in the middle of a tribe that had no centre at all, which honestly might have made it harder to conquer, not easier. There was no palace to capture and no king to force into submission, just villages and hill forts spread across a peninsula with nothing tying them together except the tribe's own name. Most of Rome's conquests in Britain followed a pattern you will see again and again on this list. Find the capital, take the capital, rule through whoever used to run it. The Dumnonii broke that pattern just by existing the way they did. Rome still won eventually, but it had to win a peninsula instead of a palace, one hill fort and one village at a time. That's a much slower and much less satisfying kind of victory to write home about. Now the evidence gets sharper because entry 7 gives us two separate pre-Roman settlements stacked on top of each other in time. Around 400 BC, Britons built a hill fort on St. Catherine's Hill, a defended position covering roughly 9 hectares overlooking the valley. That alone would be enough for most lists, but around 100 BC something bigger happened nearby. A new defended settlement went up at a place now called Orum's Arbor, sitting on the slope above the river Itchen. It covered around 20 hectares, which made it up to 4 times larger than most hill forts in the region, including the older one on St. Catherine's Hill. And it was built in an unusual spot for a defended site. Hill forts almost always sit on isolated hilltops, chosen for the view and the difficulty of climbing up to them. Orum's Arbor broke that rule. It sat on a slope leading down to a river crossing, which strongly suggests it worked as a market as much as a fortress. It was a place built for people to come and go and trade, not just a place built to be defended from a hill. That combination, a defended boundary wrapped around a working market, is a meaningfully different kind of settlement than a pure hill fort. It suggests organized control over trade and movement through the Itchen Valley, not just a retreat for hard times. Whoever built and held Orum's Arbor was managing a resource, the river crossing itself, not just hiding behind a wall. Here's the part where popular assumption and documented fact split apart, and it's worth being honest about the gap. Most people assume the Roman town was simply built on top of whichever Iron Age site came before it. What actually happened is that around AD 70, Rome laid out Venta Belgarum on a fresh piece of ground near both older sites, not directly over either one. That new site is the one that stuck. It became the medieval core of Winchester, and it's still the centre of the city today. By the 3rd century, Venta Belgarum had grown into the 5th largest city in Roman Britain, sitting on ground that had already carried 2 separate defended settlements for 500 years before Rome showed up. Hold on to that detail about Rome settling beside the old ground instead of directly on top of it, because that pattern is about to break completely by the end of this list. Entry 6 takes the timeline somewhere far more dramatic. 2.5 kilometres southwest of modern Dorchester sits Maiden Castle, one of the largest and most complex hill forts anywhere in Europe, and its story doesn't start with the Iron Age at all. Long before it was a fort, the site held a Neolithic causewayed enclosure, a ceremonial gathering ground marked out with rings of ditches and banks rather than solid defensive walls. It was built roughly 4,000 years before the hill fort phase even began. People used causewayed enclosures like this one for seasonal gatherings, for trade between scattered farming communities, and very likely for ritual and burial long before anyone on this hill was thinking about defense at all. Around 600 BC, Britons converted the site into a proper hill fort, and by around 350 BC, the Durotriges tribe had expanded it into something enormous. What survives today is 45 acres ringed by multiple concentric chalk ramparts, tall enough and deep enough that walking the ditches today still takes real effort. This wasn't a village with a fence around it. It ranked among the most heavily defended places in the entire country, built by a tribe that clearly expected to need every one of those ramparts. Then Rome arrived, and the documented version of what happened is blunt. Sometime between AD 43 and 47, Roman forces stormed the fort, breaking through its eastern gate. Rather than rebuild inside the old ramparts, Rome constructed an entirely new planned town to the northeast, which became Durnovaria, the civitas capital of the Durotriges. Maiden Castle itself was abandoned by the end of the 1st century AD, left to the hillside it had dominated for 6 centuries. Do the arithmetic on this one, because it's worth doing slowly. The hillfort phase alone predates Rome's arrival in Britain by around 650 years, and the ceremonial site underneath that hillfort was already 4,000 years old by the time the hillfort itself was built. Layer those numbers together and you get a piece of ground that people had been shaping, defending, and gathering on for close to 5,000 years before a single Roman soldier climbed its slopes. Before we go further, it's worth stopping to see the pattern so far. Gloucester gave us an old crossing with no city attached. Leicester gave us a defended riverside settlement with a name we can still translate. Exeter gave us a tribe too spread out to have one home. Winchester gave us 2 stacked settlements and a documented correction to a popular assumption. Dorchester gave us a hill fort standing on ceremonial ground, already thousands of years old. None of those 5 entries, as impressive as they are, come with a name we can still say out loud. No king, no coin, no written record. That changes completely from here. The next 3 entries each have a named ruler, a minted currency, or both, and the final 2 entries after that go back so far that kings, coins, and even the tribes themselves hadn't been invented yet. Entry 5 is where this list gets its first real names attached to a throne. Around 20 BC, a man named Tasciovanus became king of the Catuvelauni and ruled from Velamion, the settlement that would one day become St. Albans. We know this because his coins survive. Minting began there around 10 BC, stamped with his name, which means this wasn't just a settlement. It was a functioning government with its own currency. That's worth pausing on because a coin is a very specific kind of evidence. A hill fort tells you people defended themselves. A coin tells you people trusted a shared system enough to trade a stamped piece of metal for goods, which means Velamion had markets, merchants, and some form of law holding all of it together. This wasn't scattered huts behind a ditch. It was a working economy with a name and a face attached to its currency, decades before Rome ever set foot on the island. Tasciovanus didn't hold that position forever. Around AD 9 or 10, his son Cunobeline took power and made a decision that reshaped the whole region. He moved the seat of Catuvelaunian government away from Velamion to Camulodunum, a rival stronghold to the east. Velamion kept minting coins in Cunobeline's name, even after losing him as a resident ruler, which tells you the site remained economically important even after it stopped being the political centre. By the time Rome invaded in AD 43, Velamion had grown into a full oppidum, a large fortified settlement with real infrastructure, not just a hill fort or a market crossing. An oppidum, in the plainest terms, was the closest thing Iron Age Britain had to a city. It combined government, trade, and craft production in one place, rather than spreading those functions across separate villages the way the Dumnonii did further west. Velamion had already lived through one king, watched his son leave for a bigger prize, and kept functioning anyway. That resilience is easy to miss in a list built around kings and conquests, but it might be the more important detail. Places survive changes in leadership. Empires come and go. The ground and whoever keeps working it tends to outlast both. Conobelin's move sets up entry 4 perfectly, but first Canterbury earns its place on its own merits. Around 30 BC, the Cantiaci tribe built an oppidum on the River Stour that was triple-ditched, meaning it had 3 separate defensive boundaries ringing the settlement, each one dug and maintained by hand. Inside those ditches, archaeologists have found clay quarries, roundhouses, and early gravel streets, which means people were already laying down a version of urban infrastructure a full 70 years before Rome invaded. Think about what a gravel street actually represents. A small band of farmers has no reason to build one. Laying gravel down means enough people were living and working in one place that the ground under their feet needed to be managed, drained, and kept usable through a wet English winter. Clay quarrying nearby means there was a local industry, most likely pottery or building material, organized enough to be worth digging for on a regular basis. None of that fits the old picture of pre-Roman Britain as scattered huts in a forest. It fits something closer to a working town. Even the name predates the Romans. The reconstructed British name for the site is Durawanon, which translates to something like stronghold by the Aldergrove, a name that existed long before anyone started calling it Durovernum Cantiacorum in Latin records. The location wasn't chosen randomly. The site controlled the best available crossing of the River Stour, which is exactly why Roman road builders later routed the roads to Dover, Richborough, Reculver, and Lympne straight through the same spot. 4 separate Roman roads, all converging on one river crossing that Britons had already been using for a lifetime before the first Roman surveyor ever walked it. Once again, the pattern holds, and by now it should feel familiar. The Britons found the crossing first, built streets around it, and Rome simply paved over the logic that was already there. Canterbury didn't need Rome to become important. It needed Rome to write it down in Latin, which is a very different kind of contribution. Which brings us to the city Cunobelin actually moved to, and the place that carries the biggest title on this entire list. The Trinovantes built a stronghold here in the 1st century BC and called it Camulodunon, meaning stronghold of Camulos, the Celtic god of war. That name tells you exactly what kind of place its founders wanted it to be. It was likely established as their capital by a king named Adidamarus, whose surviving coins date the settlement to somewhere around 25 to 10 BC. Coins like these are also how historians notice something else about Camulodunum. Burial sites near the settlement are missing certain imported pottery styles that show up reliably at other Iron Age sites from a slightly later period, and that absence is itself a clue. It suggests some of the burials here predate the wider run of continental trade goods. That pushes the earliest activity at Camulodunum back into the middle of the 1st century BC, earlier than the coin evidence alone would suggest. The Trinovantes didn't keep control of it forever. Around AD 9, the neighbouring Catuvelauni overran them and took the stronghold for themselves, which is exactly how Cunobelin ended up ruling from here instead of from his father's old capital at Velamion. Here's the title this city carries, and it's worth stating precisely because the wording matters. Camulodunum is widely recorded as Britain's oldest recorded town, meaning it's the earliest British settlement to appear by name in written and numismatic records. That's a real and documented distinction. But it's a narrower claim than it sounds, because oldest recorded isn't the same thing as oldest inhabited. Put it next to the rest of the world for a second. Comparative lists of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth put places like Argos in Greece at somewhere around 7,000 years of habitation, and Athens at somewhere around 5,000. Colchester's claim to fame isn't that kind of number. Its claim is documentary. The first British name written down and stamped on a coin, not the longest human presence on a single patch of ground. Camulodunum won the paperwork. It didn't win the ground. and the next two entries are about to make that gap impossible to ignore. Everything so far on this list has been measured in centuries. Entry 2 measures itself in thousands of years, and it doesn't involve a tribe, a king, or a coins, because none of those things existed yet. Thatcham holds one of the best preserved Mesolithic sites in the country, dated to somewhere between 8400 and 7500 BC. Archaeologists have recovered flint tools and bone implements along ancient river channels there, left behind by semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who kept returning to the same stretch of ground for centuries at a time. Semi-nomadic is the important word there, and getting precise about what it means changes how you should picture this place. These weren't people who built a wall and stayed put forever. They moved with the seasons, followed game and fish and ripening plants, and lived in temporary camps rather than permanent houses. What makes Thatcham unusual isn't that anyone lived there full-time for 8,000 years straight. It's that this particular stretch of riverside land was good enough, useful enough, and familiar enough that generation after generation of hunter-gatherers kept coming back to it, long after the people who first found it were gone. For years, Thatcham held the title of Britain's oldest continuously inhabited settlement, commonly dated to around 7700 BC, and it's still listed in the Guinness Book of Records as the strongest historical claimant to that title. That isn't folklore. It's a documented record held for decades. Here's the honest, surprising twist. In 2014, excavations at a site called Blickmead, near Amesbury, pushed continuous occupation back even further to around 9160 BC, and the title changed hands. Sit with that for a second. An official record for the oldest continuously inhabited place in an entire country got overturned within the last 15 years. Run the clock on what that actually means. Thatcham's hunter-gatherers were already working this ground more than 8,000 years before Rome landed in Britain, at a point in history when nobody involved had a word for tribe, let alone a word for Britain itself. That's the place that took Thatcham's title and currently holds it. Amesbury in Wiltshire is recognised as the longest continuously inhabited settlement in the United Kingdom, with occupation traced back to roughly 8820 BC. That number isn't a rounded guess, it's the result of the same kind of excavation and dating work that moved the record away from Thatcham in the first place. Walk through what that ground actually contains, layer by layer, because each one represents a completely different way of life stacked on top of the last. It starts with Mesolithic hunter-gatherer camps, the same kind of seasonal sites found at Thatcham, people moving with the seasons rather than settling in one spot. Then comes the Neolithic period, when the same general area saw the construction of Stonehenge itself and the barrow cemeteries that surround it, a shift from temporary camps to permanent monuments meant to last. After that, Bronze Age communities kept using the land for ritual purposes, and settlement continued from there straight through into the historical period, all within one relatively concentrated stretch of ground. That's hunter-gatherers, then monument builders, then farmers, then a continuous thread of ordinary settlement, all occupying the same ground without ever fully abandoning it. Picture a fire kept low in a hearth through a cold night, somewhere on that ground, thousands of years before anyone nearby had a name for a king or a country. The fire went out and got relit more times than anyone could count, by people who never once heard the word Rome. When Rome invaded in AD 43, this ground had already been used, reshaped, and treated as sacred for close to 9,000 years. Put the entire Roman occupation of Britain next to that number, and it barely registers. Rome held Britain for under 400 years. This one patch of Wiltshire had already been lived on for more than 20 times that long before Rome ever arrived, and this is the detail that separates entry 1 from everything else on this list. Every other place we have covered is a site Rome either built beside or built directly onto, borrowing a crossing, a rampart, or a name that already existed. Amesbury doesn't need Rome in its story at all. It was already extraordinary 9,000 years before anyone in Italy had a reason to care what Britain was. Stand on that ground in Wiltshire and you're standing on almost 9,000 years of continuous human presence, longer than recorded history itself in most of the world. Tell us in the comments which of these 10 surprised you the most, and consider subscribing, because we cover the history that gets skipped. Not because it's obscure, but because it takes time to sit with.